1 year after Andrew's gift, the 5 recipient families gathered in Memphis for a memorial service. They sat with Andrew's mom in the hospital chapel where she had made her decision. Each one shared how their lives had changed, how they were living fully in honor of the gift they had received. The 12-year-old girl, now strong and healthy, had taken up basketball. The teacher had started a support group for transplant recipients. The single mother had gone back to school. The grandfather was writing a book about his journey. The college student was excelling in his pre-med studies. As they shared their stories, Andrew's mom smiled through her tears. She saw pieces of her son in each of them, his determination in the young girl's eyes, his compassion in the teacher's words, his joy in the mother's laugh, his wisdom in the grandfather's stories, his dream in the student's ambitions. The chapel's candles flickered as the sun set outside, casting warm light through the stained glass windows. On the wall hung a new edition, a simple photograph of a young boy in a basketball jersey, his smile bright and genuine. Below it, a quote read, "Life is a gift meant to be shared." Andrew's legacy lived on not just in the lives he saved, but in the countless others inspired by his story. He had dreamed of becoming a doctor to help others. In the end, he had done exactly that, just not in the way anyone could have imagined. His final act of kindness had created a ripple effect of hope and healing that would continue touching lives for years to come. In the weeks that followed, stories began emerging from hospitals across Tennessee. 5 different families celebrated miracles, each one connected by a thread of kindness that started with a 16-year-old boy from Memphis. These weren't just medical successes, they were stories of hope, renewal, and the power of one person's final gift. In Nashville, a 12-year-old girl who had been confined to her hospital bed for 8 months took her first steps with her new heart. Her doctors watched in amazement as she walked the length of the corridor, her smile growing wider with each step. "I can feel it beating," she told her parents, placing their hands over her chest. "It feels strong, like it wants to dance." The young girl's recovery was remarkable. Within months, she was back in school, sharing her story with classmates. She carried a small photo in her notebook, not of Andrew, whom she had never met, but of his basketball shoes. His mom had given them to her, and she kept them as a reminder to make every heartbeat count. In Knoxville, a high school teacher who had received Andrew's lungs returned to his classroom after a year of absence. His students had decorated his desk with paper flowers, each one containing a message of welcome. As he took his first deep breath to speak to his class, he paused, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of breathing freely. Every breath, he would tell his students, is a gift that reminds us to live fully. The teacher started a new tradition in his school. Every year, he would take his students to volunteer at the local hospital. "Someone I never met gave me a second chance," he would explain. "The least we can do is pay that kindness forward." A single mother of 3, who had received Andrew's liver, watched her children play in the park for the first time in years. She no longer had to view their childhood from the sidelines, too sick to participate. "I can be the mother they deserve now," she said, her eyes filled with happy tears as she chased her youngest around the playground. The 2 kidney recipients, both long-term dialysis patients, found themselves free from the machines that had controlled their lives for years. One of them, an elderly grandfather, finally got to attend his granddaughter's wedding, dancing with her just as he had promised. The other, a young college student, returned to university to study medicine, inspired by the gift that had saved his life. But perhaps the most profound change happened back in Memphis. Andrew's mom channeled her grief into action, establishing the Andrew Memorial Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful: to promote organ donation awareness in underserved communities and provide support for families going through the donation process. The foundation's first initiative was creating a scholarship program for high school students interested in medical careers. Andrew dreamed of becoming a doctor, his mom would say at speaking engagements. Through these scholarships, his dream lives on in others. The hospital where Andrew had volunteered underwent its own transformation. The pediatric ward, where he had spent so many hours reading to young patients, was renamed the Andrew Reading Room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books donated by the community. A small plaque by the door bore his favorite saying, "Every page turned is a new adventure shared." The basketball team at his high school created a new award, the Andrew Spirit Award, given not to the best player, but to the player who best demonstrated compassion and service to others. His old jersey number 23 was retired, hanging in the gym as a reminder that true greatness isn't measured in points scored, but in lives touched. Word of Andrew's story spread beyond Tennessee. News outlets picked up the story, not just of his donation, but of the extraordinary moment when an entire hospital staff bowed in respect. The image of that honor walk, captured on a nurse's phone, went viral, touching hearts across the world. The impact rippled outward. Organ donation registrations in Tennessee increased by 50% in the months following Andrew's story. Other hospitals began incorporating more meaningful recognition of organ donors, inspired by the spontaneous bow that had started in Memphis. Near the operating room doors, the transplant team waited, also bowing as the bed approached. They understood better than most the magnitude of what was about to happen, how one young life would soon save many others. Their usual professional detachment was nowhere to be seen. Instead, they stood with visible emotion on their faces. Andrew's mom paused just before the final doors. She looked at the gathered crowd, at all these people who had known her son in different ways, as a volunteer, as a dreamer, as a helper, as a friend. She saw in their faces what she felt in her heart, that Andrew's impact would live on far beyond this moment. The chief of surgery stepped forward, himself breaking protocol by bowing deeply to both Andrew and his mother. "We promise," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed hallway, "to honor his gift with all the skill and respect we possess." As the doors opened for the final time, the gathered staff raised their lights higher, creating a beautiful glow that seemed to follow the bed into the operating room. The last image they saw was Andrew's mom, still walking tall, still holding that basketball photo, still being the kind of parent who had raised a son capable of such an extraordinary final act of kindness. The doors closed silently, but no one moved. For several minutes, the entire hallway remained still, united in this moment of profound respect and gratitude. They had just witnessed something more than a hospital tradition. They had been part of a moment that would redefine what it meant to be a hero. The hospital halls grew unusually quiet as evening settled in. Word had spread through the building about what was about to happen. Nurses paused their rounds, doctors stepped out of their offices, and even the cleaning staff stopped their work. Something extraordinary was about to take place in the corridors of Memphis General Hospital. The honor walk, a tradition reserved for organ donors, was about to begin. But this one would be different. This one would touch hearts in ways no one could have predicted. It started with a simple message passed through the hospital staff: "Honor walk for Andrew, 7 p.m., 3rd floor." The response was unprecedented. Staff members who had finished their shifts stayed behind. Those who weren't scheduled to work came in anyway. They came from every department: surgery, pediatrics, maintenance, cafeteria, administration. "I had to be here," whispered one of the cafeteria workers who had often seen Andrew sharing his lunch with lonely patients. That boy would always make sure everyone had someone to talk to during meal times. By 6:45 p.m., the hallway leading to the operating room was lined with hospital staff. They stood silently, creating a path of honor. Some wore scrubs, others whitecoats, some in maintenance uniforms, but all were united in their purpose. The usually bright hospital lights were dimmed slightly, creating a solemn atmosphere that matched the moment's gravity. A nurse who had worked with Andrew during his volunteer hours dabbed at her eyes. "He used to say that these halls were like the arteries of the hospital," she recalled softly to her colleague. "He said they carried hope from one room to another." Now, these same halls would carry his final gift. At precisely 7 p.m., the doors to Andrew's room opened. The bed was wheeled out slowly, deliberately. His mom walked alongside, her head held high despite her tears, one hand resting gently on the rail of her son's bed. The other hand held a small photo, Andrew in his basketball uniform, smiling that bright smile that had lit up so many lives. What happened next would be talked about in the hospital for years to come. As the bed began its journey down the hallway, something spontaneous and unprecedented occurred. The first row of medical staff didn't just stand in respectful silence, they bowed deeply. The gesture rippled through the crowd like a wave, each person bowing as the bed passed. Dr. Chen, the emergency room physician who had first treated Andrew, later explained through tears, "In all my years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. It just happened. When you think about what this 16-year-old boy was about to do, save 5 lives, how could we not bow? The procession moved slowly down the corridor. The only sounds were soft footsteps and the gentle wheeling of the bed. Some staff members held small electric candles, their light creating a gentle glow in the dimmed hallway. Others held their phones with their flashlights on, creating a path of light. A security guard who had often chatted with Andra during his volunteer shifts stood at attention, tears streaming down his face. He always said hello to everyone, he would later tell a reporter. Didn't matter if you were the head surgeon or the person emptying the trash, to him, everyone mattered. As they passed the pediatric ward, where Andra had spent so many hours reading to sick children, the nurses there had placed a row of stuffed animals along the windowsill, each one holding a small thank you note. One of the young patients, awake past their bedtime, pressed their hand against the glass in a silent goodbye. The walk, which normally took 2 minutes, stretched to nearly 10 as more and more staff members joined the procession. Those who couldn't fit in the hallway stood in doorways and connected corridors. The maintenance staff had even positioned themselves on the lower floor, visible through the glass walkway, all of them looking up with hands over their hearts. Halfway through the journey, someone began to hum softly, Amazing Grace. The melody spread quietly through the gathered crowd, a gentle soundtrack to this powerful moment. No one sang the words. They didn't need to. The music itself carried all the emotion they needed to express. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridors as final preparations began. Medical instruments were sterilized, operating rooms were prepared, and transport helicopters waited on the roof. Everything was in place for what would be one of the most coordinated medical efforts the hospital had ever undertaken. Andrew's mom stood by his bedside one last time, holding his hand as she had done countless times before. She thought about all the times he had talked about wanting to help people, about becoming a doctor, about making a difference in the world. Now, in a way none of them could have imagined, he would do exactly that. A soft knock at the door signaled it was time. Dr. Thompson entered with his team, their faces showing both professional composure and deep respect. "We're ready," he said gently. "Everything is in place." Andrew's mom nodded, knowing that somewhere in Tennessee, 5 families were about to receive the calls they had been desperately waiting for. As the sun began to set on that Friday evening, Andrew's legacy was about to begin its journey. In 5 different hospitals, medical teams stood ready. In 5 different waiting rooms, families held their breath. And in Memphis General Hospital, a young boy who had dreamed of saving lives was about to do exactly that, touching more lives than he ever could have imagined possible. Friday morning arrived at Memphis General Hospital with a gentle sunrise, its warm light filtering through the windows of the intensive care unit. The medical team had worked through the night, conducting detailed tests and carefully reviewing every aspect of Andrew's condition. What they discovered would change not just one life, but many. Dr. Thompson, the lead transplant coordinator, stood at the nurse's station, reviewing the results with growing amazement. In his 20 years of transplant medicine, he had rarely seen anything like this. Andrew's young, healthy organs were in perfect condition, and his blood type and tissue markers made him an ideal donor for multiple recipients. "It's remarkable," he explained to his team, spreading out the test results on the desk. "His heart is strong, his lungs are pristine, and his other organs are in excellent condition." The team gathered around, their expressions a mixture of professional interest and personal emotion. Many of them had known Andrew from his volunteer work in the pediatric ward. In another part of the hospital, the transplant matching system was working overtime. Computers hummed as they cross-referenced Andrew's genetic markers with thousands of waiting recipients. Names began appearing on screens, each one representing a person whose life hung in the balance, waiting for a miracle. The first match came quickly. A 12-year-old girl in Nashville had been waiting for a heart for 8 months. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and her doctors had feared she wouldn't make it another week. The second match was a teacher with cystic fibrosis who needed lungs. One by one, the matches continued to appear, each one perfectly suited to receive one of Andrew's healthy organs. Back in the ICU, Andrew's mom sat with the hospital chaplain, who had known both her and Andrew for years. "You know," the chaplain said softly, "I remember when Andrew first started volunteering here. He used to say that doctors were like puzzle solvers, finding the right pieces to help people heal. She smiled through her tears. He's still solving puzzles, isn't he? The transplant team worked with incredible efficiency, coordinating with multiple hospitals across the state. Phone calls were made, transport teams were assembled, and medical crews prepared for the complex procedures ahead. Time was crucial. They had a narrow window to help 5 different people in 5 different locations. In the hospital break room, nurses who had worked with Andrew's mom for years gathered to offer support. They shared stories about Andrew, how he would bring homemade cookies to the nurse's station, how he knew every security guard by name, how he would spend extra time with the lonely patients who didn't get many visitors. Remember when he organized that small library for the pediatric ward? One nurse recalled, wiping her eyes. He noticed the kids got bored during long hospital stays, so he collected books from his whole neighborhood. Another added, and he labeled them all himself, made a proper checkout system and everything. The transplant coordinator returned with more details about the recipients. Each story struck a chord. The young girl who dreamed of dancing again, the teacher who wanted to return to his classroom, the single parent who just wanted to see their children grow up. These weren't just medical cases, they were people whose lives would be transformed by Andrew's gift. Outside Andrew's room, a wall of get-well cards had appeared, brought by his school friends who didn't yet know the full situation. The cards were colorful and hopeful, filled with messages about basketball games and study sessions. The school principal had stopped by, bringing Andrew's latest test results, all A's even in the advanced placement classes he had been taking to prepare for his dream of medical school. As the day progressed, medical teams from different hospitals began arriving. They gathered in conference rooms, reviewing procedures and coordinating their efforts. The complexity of managing multiple organ donations required precise timing and careful planning. Each team would need to work in perfect synchronization with the others. In the hospital's small meditation garden, Andrew's basketball coach sat with several team members who had come to show support. They talked about Andrew's last practice, how he had stayed late to help a freshman player perfect his free throws. That was just who he was, the coach said, his voice rough with emotion. Always thinking about others, always trying to help. The paperwork was brought in, each form explained with gentle patience. As she signed her name, she thought about how Andrew's handwriting had looked so similar to hers, how he had practiced his signature over and over, saying he needed it to be perfect for when he became a doctor and had to sign charts. Outside the chapel, the hospital was beginning to wake up for another day. Staff were changing shifts, machines were beeping, families were arriving to visit loved ones. Life was continuing its normal rhythm, even though for one mother, nothing would ever be normal again. Yet in this moment of deepest grief, she felt Andrew's presence more strongly than ever. She could almost hear him saying, "You're doing the right thing, Mom. This is how we help people. This is how we make a difference." In choosing to donate his organs, she was not just honoring his wishes, she was helping him achieve, in death, what he had dreamed of doing in life, giving others a chance to live. As the sun rose fully over Memphis, casting long shadows through the chapel windows, Andrew's mom stood up, straightened her scrubs, and walked out with Nancy. There was more paperwork to complete, more decisions to make. But she knew with absolute certainty that somewhere Andrew was smiling, proud that even now he would be helping others, just as he had always wanted to do. In the quiet hours of that devastating night, Andrew's mom found herself in the hospital chapel, a place she had passed by countless times during her shifts, but rarely entered. The small room was dimly lit by flickering candles, their soft light casting gentle shadows on the walls. She sat in the front row, her nurse's badge still clipped to her scrubs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The events of the past few hours felt like a terrible dream. Just this morning, she had watched Andrew pack his lunch, had reminded him about his basketball practice, had kissed him goodbye. Now, in this peaceful sanctuary, memories washed over her like waves, each one more vivid than the last. She remembered a particular evening from just 3 months ago. They had been sitting on their worn but comfortable couch, sharing a bowl of popcorn while watching a documentary about organ donation. Andrew had been unusually quiet throughout the program, absorbing every detail with that intense focus she knew so well. "Mom," he had said suddenly, turning to face her with those serious eyes of his, if anything ever happened to me. She had tried to stop him there, not wanting to discuss such things, but he had persisted. No, Mom, listen. If I couldn't use my body anymore, I'd want someone else to have a chance at life. Promise me you'll remember that. At the time, she had brushed it off as just another one of his passionate responses to learning something new. Andra had always been like that, deeply moved by the possibility of helping others. She had changed the subject, suggesting they watch something lighter, but now, in the chapel's silence, his words echoed in her mind with new significance. A soft knock at the chapel door interrupted her thoughts. It was Nancy, one of the transplant coordinators she had worked with many times before. Nancy sat beside her, not speaking at first, just offering her presence. The silence between them was comfortable, understanding. I know this isn't the right time, Nancy finally said, her voice gentle, but as both your colleague and friend, I needed to be the one to talk to you about this. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Andrew's condition. There are families out there, families with children, parents, people who have been waiting for months, some for years. The words hung in the air, their weight almost tangible. Andrew's mom closed her eyes, seeing again her son's earnest face as he talked about wanting to help others, about becoming a doctor, about making a difference in the world. Even at 16, he had understood something that many adults never grasped, the profound impact one life could have on many others. She stood up suddenly, walking to the small window that overlooked the hospital garden. The first hints of dawn were beginning to color the sky, painting it in soft shades of pink and gold. How many sunrises had Andrew watched from his bedroom window, dreaming of his future in medicine? How many times had he talked about wanting to save lives? In her mind, she could hear his voice clearly. Mom, being a doctor isn't just about treating patients. It's about giving people hope. He had said that after his first day volunteering in the pediatric ward, his eyes shining with purpose and understanding beyond his years. Turning back to Nancy, she saw not just a transplant coordinator, but all the families she herself had watched wait for miracle calls over her years of nursing. She thought about the teenagers she had cared for, some just Andrew's age, their lives hanging by a thread as they waited for compatible organs. How many times had she prayed for donor families to say yes? The decision crystallized in her heart, not with the sharp pain she expected, but with a sense of rightness that somehow eased her grief, if only slightly. This was what Andrew would have wanted. No, this was what Andrew had specifically asked for. In his final act, he would achieve what he had always dreamed of doing. He would save lives. Her voice was steady when she spoke, surprising even herself. Andrew told me what he wanted. He made me promise to remember. She turned to Nancy, tears in her eyes but determination in her voice. He wanted to give others a chance at life. I need to honor that. Memories flooded her mind. Andrew as a toddler, taking his first steps in their small living room. Andrew on his first day of school, proudly wearing his new backpack. Andrew at his basketball games, always looking to the stands to make sure she was watching. Andrew just last week, explaining to her his plans for medical school, his eyes bright with dreams and determination. The nurses who had worked with her for years took turns sitting with her, offering silent support. They'd brought her water, made sure she ate something, covered her patients without being asked. This was more than professional courtesy. This was family taking care of family. Every person in that hospital who knew Andrew from his volunteer work, who had watched him grow up in these halls, felt the weight of this loss. As the night deepened, more test results came back, each one confirming the initial diagnosis. The medical team had done everything humanly possible, had used every tool and technique available to modern medicine. But sometimes, even in a building dedicated to saving lives, death cannot be negotiated with. Yet even in this darkest moment, none of them could have imagined how Andrew's story would continue. None of them knew that in the coming days, their grief would transform into something powerful and meaningful. That this tragedy would spark a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. That in losing his life, Andrew would give others a second chance at theirs. In the quiet of that hospital room, with machines beeping steadily and the night shift moving quietly through their rounds, a mother sat beside her son, holding his hand. And somewhere, in another part of the hospital, files were being reviewed, matches were being found, and the groundwork was being laid for Andrew's final, most powerful act of kindness. The emergency room at Memphis General Hospital was unusually quiet that evening when the ambulance sirens pierced the air. The sound grew louder, and the medical team assembled quickly, their movements precise and practiced. They had done this countless times before, but something about this case would stay with them forever. Andrew's mom was checking on a patient in room 302 when she first heard the sirens. She felt an unexplainable heaviness in her heart, the kind that mothers sometimes get when they sense something isn't right. She had just finished adjusting her patient's IV drip when her supervisor appeared at the door, face tight with concern. "You need to come with me," she said softly, "right now." The walk to the emergency room felt like the longest journey of her life. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with an intensity she had never noticed before. She could hear snippets of conversation between the medical staff, could see them glancing at her with a mix of sympathy and professional concern. When she reached the trauma bay, time seemed to stand still. Through the glass, she could see a team of doctors working frantically around a patient. The reflective strips on the torn backpack caught her eye first. She had picked that backpack herself, had insisted on those safety features. Her knees weakened, but she remained standing, years of nursing experience keeping her upright even as her world began to crumble. Dr. Chen, the head of emergency medicine, stepped out to speak with her. His face, usually composed and professional, showed signs of genuine distress. "Your son arrived a few minutes ago," he began gently. "He was struck by a vehicle while crossing at Monroe and 5th. We're doing everything we can." The words hit her like physical blows, each one threatening to knock her off her feet. Inside the trauma room, machines beat steadily, monitoring every aspect of Andrew's condition. The team worked with incredible focus, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. They had already performed initial scans, had already seen the extent of the damage, but they refused to slow down, refused to give up. Andrew's mom stood at his bedside, still in her nursing scrubs, holding his hand. The same hand that had helped her cook dinner just yesterday, that had written countless notes about becoming a doctor, that had high-fived his teammates after winning games. It was still warm, but different somehow. The steady rise and fall of his chest was maintained by machines, their rhythmic sounds filling the otherwise quiet room. Hours passed like minutes, minutes like hours. More tests were run, more specialists consulted. The neurology team arrived, their faces grave as they reviewed the scan results. Dr. Wilson, the chief neurologist, asked to speak with Andrew's mom privately. The small consultation room felt suffocating as she sat down, already knowing in her heart what she was about to hear. "The trauma to his brain was severe," Dr. Wilson explained, his voice gentle but direct. "Despite all our interventions, there's no activity in the areas that control consciousness and essential functions." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "I'm so sorry," he added, his professional demeanor cracking slightly, "but your son will not wake up." The words echoed in the small room, bouncing off the walls and reverberating through her entire being. As a nurse, she had been present for countless similar conversations. She had watched other families receive devastating news, had offered comfort and support. But nothing had prepared her for being on this side of the conversation. Outside the consultation room, the hospital continued its normal rhythm. Phones rang, nurses called out to each other, wheels squeaked on the polished floor. But inside this small space, a mother's world had stopped turning. She sat there, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her nurse's badge catching the light from overhead. The impact was devastating. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a thunderclap, drawing people from their homes and nearby businesses. Within moments, a crowd had gathered. Someone was already calling 911, their voice shaking as they tried to explain what had happened. A nurse from a nearby clinic rushed to Andrew's side, her training kicking in even as her hands trembled. The emergency response was swift. Within minutes, the air was filled with the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights painted the scene in alternating colors as police cars and an ambulance arrived. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, their faces grave as they assessed Andrew's condition. Their movements were quick but careful as they stabilized him for transport. The same streets that Andrew had walked countless times before were now lined with concerned faces. His backpack lay a few feet away, one strap torn, papers scattered across the pavement like fallen leaves. Someone had picked up his phone, which was still displaying the unread message from his study group. The screen was cracked, but it still glowed faintly, a reminder of the normal day this had been just moments ago. As the ambulance sped toward Memphis General Hospital, lights flashing and siren wailing, the paramedics worked tirelessly to keep Andra stable. They couldn't know then that this young man, this 16-year-old boy who had dreamed of joining their ranks as a medical professional, would soon inspire an entire hospital staff to bow in respect. They couldn't know that his story would touch hearts across the world, or that his final act would bring hope to multiple families. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the city. At the hospital, teams of medical professionals were already being alerted, preparing for the arrival of a critical trauma patient. And somewhere across town, Andra's mom was just starting her evening shift, unaware that her world was about to change forever and that her son's legacy would impact more lives than she could ever imagine. It was just another Wednesday afternoon in Memphis, the kind of spring day that made everyone feel alive. The sky was painted in shades of golden orange as the sun began its descent, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming magnolia trees. Andra had just finished basketball practice, his team preparing for the upcoming state championships. His coach had kept him a little longer than usual, working on some new plays they planned to use in the big game. "Great work today," his coach had said, patting him on the shoulder. "You're really leading the team well." Andra had smiled, quickly changing out of his practice jersey and into his favorite blue t-shirt. He had planned to stop by the library to pick up some new medical books before heading home. His mom was working the evening shift at the hospital, and he wanted to surprise her by cooking dinner before she got back. Walking out of the gym, Andra adjusted the straps of his backpack, the one with reflective strips that his mom had insisted on buying for him. Safety first, she always said, and though he had initially thought it looked a bit childish, he wore it faithfully. Inside were his carefully organized notebooks, each filled with detailed notes from his advanced placement classes, and a small lunch container with the cookies he hadn't finished at break time. The streets were relatively quiet, with just a few cars passing by. Andra walked along his usual route, mentally planning out the evening ahead. He needed to finish his chemistry homework, prepare dinner, and maybe squeeze in some time to work on his essay about why he wanted to become a doctor. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his study group asking about tomorrow's meeting. He made a mental note to respond once he reached the library. Several of his basketball teammates drove past, honking and waving. "Need a ride?" They called out, but Andra shook his head with a smile. "Library's just a few blocks away," he shouted back. He loved these walks. They gave him time to think, to dream about his future in medicine, to plan how he would help people once he became a doctor. As he approached the intersection, everything seemed normal. The crossing signal showed the white walking figure, and Andra did what he always did, looked both ways, just like his mom had taught him since he was little. A few other pedestrians were waiting to cross from the other side. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the sidewalk. He was halfway across when he heard it, the screech of tires, the sound of an engine revving too hard, too fast. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Andra turned his head toward the sound, his eyes widening as he saw the red sedan approaching. The driver's face was illuminated by the blue glow of a phone screen, their attention anywhere but on the road ahead. Later, witnesses would tell the police everything they saw, how the car ran the red light, how Andra had the right of way, how the driver never even looked up until it was too late. Some would recall how Andra's backpack, with its reflective strips, caught the sunlight one last time before impact. Others would remember the terrible sound of brakes being slammed too late. In those final seconds, Andra's last conscious action was purely instinctive. He tried to push away a younger student who was crossing near him. It was so characteristic of who he was, always thinking of others even in moments of crisis. The crossing guard would later tell Andra's mom through tears how her son's final act had been one of protection, one of sacrifice. As spring turned to summer, Andra's dedication only grew stronger. He had started an after-school study group for students interested in medical careers, sharing everything he had learned from his mom and his time volunteering. The group started with just 3 students but quickly grew to 15, meeting twice a week in the school library. His basketball teammates respected him not just for his skills on the court, but for his ability to stay focused on his goals. Even during championship games, he'd have a medical terminology book in his gym bag, studying between quarters. Some people called him crazy for working so hard, but Andrew knew that great achievements required extraordinary effort. Little did anyone know that this ordinary yet extraordinary teenager would soon become a symbol of hope and inspiration for the entire medical community, touching lives in ways that no one could have imagined. His story would prove that sometimes the biggest impacts come from the most unexpected sources, and that age is just a number when it comes to changing the world. The sun was setting over Memphis, Tennessee, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of the East Side neighborhood. The warm spring air carried the distant sounds of children playing basketball and the gentle rustling of oak trees that lined the suburban streets. In one of these modest homes, a 16-year-old boy sat at his kitchen table, textbooks spread out before him, his face illuminated by determination and dream-filled eyes. Andrew was different from most teenagers his age. While others rushed home to play video games or scroll through social media, he divided his time between studying and helping at the local community center. His friends often teased him about his intense focus on schoolwork, but Andrew would just smile and say, "Sometimes you have to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow." Living with his mom in their cozy two-bedroom house, Andrew had grown up watching her work tirelessly as a nurse at the local hospital. Every evening, she would return home with stories, some heartbreaking, others inspiring, about the patients she had helped that day. These stories shaped Andrew's worldview in ways neither of them fully realized at the time. Their home wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and the sweet aroma of home-cooked meals. Photos lined the walls. Andrew's first day of school, his basketball tournaments, and proud moments with his mom at various academic award ceremonies. One particular photo stood out. Andrew at age 12, dressed up as a doctor for career day, wearing an oversized white coat borrowed from one of his mom's colleagues. At school, Andrew maintained straight A's while playing point guard for the basketball team. His teachers often remarked that he had a natural ability to lead and inspire others. During chemistry class, he would help struggling classmates understand complex concepts, breaking them down into simple terms everyone could grasp. His basketball coach would say, "That boy's got more heart than players twice his size." But what truly set Andrew apart was his weekly routine at the hospital. Every Saturday morning, while other teenagers were sleeping in, he would volunteer in the pediatric ward. He'd spend hours reading stories to young patients, making them laugh with his silly voices and bringing moments of joy to their difficult days. The nurses would watch in amazement as even the most withdrawn children would light up when he entered their rooms. One particular moment stood out in everyone's memory. A young patient was terrified of getting their blood drawn, crying and refusing to let any nurse near them. Andrew sat with the child for almost an hour, patiently explaining how blood tests were like superhero checkups that helped doctors make sure their powers were working properly. By the end of their conversation, the child was not only calm but excited to be getting their superhero checkup. At home, Andrew would often sit with his mom during her breaks, asking detailed questions about medical procedures and patient care. His notebook was filled with medical terms and drawings of the human body. "Why do you want to know all this?" his mom would ask, smiling. Because one day he'd respond, "I want to be the kind of doctor who not only heals bodies but also gives people hope." The local community knew Andrew as the kid who would shovel snow from elderly neighbors' driveways in winter without being asked, or who would tutor younger children at the library free of charge. He had a way of noticing when people needed help before they'd even asked for it. His mom would often say that he had an old soul in a young body. Andrew's room was a testament to his dreams. Medical school brochures were pinned to a corkboard alongside basketball tournament medals. His bookshelf held an odd mix of medical textbooks borrowed from the library and comic books about superheroes saving lives. On his desk sat a piggy bank labeled Future Doctor Fund, where he saved part of his earnings from weekend jobs at the local grocery store. Each morning, Andrew would wake up early to help his mom prepare for her day shift. They had a routine. He'd make coffee while she packed their lunches, and they'd spend those quiet morning moments talking about their dreams and plans. "You know," his mom would say, "it's not just about being smart. Being a good doctor means having a big heart." Andra would nod, understanding that compassion was just as important as knowledge.